Important advice for busy Christians. That's what I've called this quite long passage. I know we just read part of it, but I'd really like to skip through really the rest of Luke 12, not because it's not important, but because, in a sense, there's lots of different things coming together, and in a way it's quite Jewish, this passage and this teaching of Jesus. It's quite like the letter of James, and what I've tried to do is just bring out the main thoughts that Jesus is teaching us here in Luke 12, which is actually Luke 12, 23 to 59. There's lots of different images, lots of different little stories, almost just one-line similes or comparisons. But I think there's a theme here that's going through it. I wonder, first of all, if you've ever had to empty a house and decide what to keep and what to throw away. I'm sure the sort of congregation we are, we've all been through that sort of move. Kathy and I were counting up the other night. I asked her, how many houses have we lived in then, Kath? In our 30 years, we've married just over 30 years now. I think we got to 11, was it 10 or 11? 12. Oh, okay, I missed one there. Which I suppose on average is, what's that? That's about one every 3 years, which is not as bad as that. I think some of those are very short times when we were coming back from Africa and then we lived in somewhere and went back and so on. But it's disruptive, isn't it? It's disruptive to move to a new house. But it's also a very useful thing to do. That's what we found anyway. Why? Well, I think it forces you, or at least it gives you the opportunity to reassess your life and to reassess all your possessions. And it's a great opportunity to downsize, to get rid of a whole lot of stuff that actually you realize you don't really need. You know, we found that. We put stuff in boxes, and then when we moved again and started to open the boxes, we thought, well, we don't need to open this. It's just, we can throw it away or give it away. Because obviously we haven't used it for the last 9, 10 months, so why do we need it? And in that process, of course, you begin to realize what is really important. What's really important to you as a person or as a family? I always think of my parents, bless them. My parents, they died the last 5, 7 years or so. And when they died, we were left to sort out their little retirement flat where they'd finished up. And you know, there wasn't a lot to throw away at all. I think they'd done amazingly well. They'd done an amazing job of relieving themselves of all their stuff that they'd acquired through their lives. My dad was 101 when he died, so he'd had quite a long time to acquire stuff. In fact, he was a potter before he went into the ministry. He was a pastor. He was a very good potter. And so we've kept 1 or 2 of his pots, his beautiful creations that he'd also kept and handed down. Even though those, of course, now gone into stores since we moved here. We haven't brought those to Athens. So, in a way, why do we need those? I don't know. But they're important to us because they remind us of my father and of his life and Mum and their lives. And it was really impressive that when they came to the end of their lives, there wasn't a lot left. They'd sorted themselves out. They'd prioritized. Now, in our passage today, as I said, it's quite a long passage, but I think the main theme is that Jesus challenges as his disciples to reassess our lives, to really decide what's important to us, and therefore let that shape our living. And he does so, I suppose, with these memorable words, like a key text, really. In verse 34, which we read, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So the question this morning is, where's your treasure? What are the things that you really treasure? Now we need to remember where we are in Luke's storyline here. We are with Jesus on his way up to Jerusalem. Some Bible scholars call this part Luke's travel narrative. Jesus is on a journey. And he set his sights on Jerusalem in Luke's Gospel back in chapter 9. And now Luke's going to take about 10 chapters of the Gospel describing how he eventually gets there. He's on this travel narrative. And that's where Jesus is as we hear him speak today. He's walking along the road with his disciples, those who are following him. And he teaches them along the way. And that is exactly what we are too, aren't we? We are disciples of Jesus. And we are walking along life's road. whatever it is for you and for me, following Jesus, and we're listening to his teaching. That's what a disciple is. A disciple is a learner. You know, it comes from the Greek word, mathetes, to be a learner, a disciple. And so in this chapter today, in our passage, I think we have four main things that Jesus wants to teach us and that we need to learn constantly, in a sense, as disciples, as we walk this pilgrim way. This is important advice for busy Christians, because we're all busy, aren't we? We all have lots of stuff going on in our lives. There's nothing wrong with that. But Jesus says, remember these important things. So first of all, Jesus says to his disciples, be trusting. Be trusting. That's verses 22 to 34, which is part of what we read. Be trusting as disciples. Jesus is, if you remember, he's just told them a parable about a rich man. That's what we were looking at last week. A rich man who was preoccupied with material things, with his barns and his farms and his harvests, with his success and his business and his wealth, with eating and drinking and being merry, but who in the end was described by God as a fool. That's what Jesus has just been teaching about. And he said, so beware of greed. Be on your guard, Jesus told his disciples and those who were listening to him. Now, as we said, that doesn't mean that God is not interested in our material needs. Not at all, says Jesus. But the key thing for the disciple is to trust in God for your needs, not in yourself. And not to be preoccupied with your material needs, but to trust in the faithfulness and the kindness of our Father in heaven. And so that's what Jesus does in this opening paragraph here. He uses creation as an example, doesn't he? Jesus points to that wonderful, that tender care of our Heavenly Father. And so he encourages us as his disciples, as listeners, along the way to consider, to be encouraged by how detailed, how gentle is God's care for us, even though he's such a great and a majestic God. Basically, Jesus is saying, look, if God cares for all his other creatures, even these little creatures, like the birds, the ravens, the sparrows, he mentions them. The flowers of the field are just so delicate and so ephemeral, so passing, but God cares for them. Well, if God cares for these little creatures, surely he'll care for you. That's what Jesus is saying. Be trusting. Don't be preoccupied with the things that do preoccupy the people and society today. We just heard this last week, didn't we? I don't know, you must correct me, but I think they've discovered 5, is it, or 7 new worlds, they think, going around a new sun, and they think possibly there may be life on it. Well, I can't remember what the amazing figures were, but it was something like 40 million light years away, so it's going to be, we'll never get there. And I just think, how amazing, this infinitude, this space that the psalmist tells us God put into being by his fingers. He's a majestic God. He keeps all that going as well. And yet he cares about the sparrow and the lilies in the field. So friend, he'll care about you. That's what Jesus is saying. You're a disciple, don't worry. He'll care about you. I suppose, that's the basic practical exhortation, isn't it? That's what Jesus says. Don't worry. Do not be afraid. And given God's care, the care of such a majestic God, we can then be generous with the things that God does provide us. That's the contrast, you see, between Jesus' attitude here and that of the rich fool last week who didn't share a thing. So certain can we be of God's care for us that we can be generous with whatever God gives us. And that's why Jesus, I think, encourages his disciples then. He says, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Have that priority. Don't hold on to things. I think the stress here is on how unattached disciples of Jesus should be to this material world. Not that there's anything wrong in it, but we serve another kingdom and another king. The virtue is not so much in giving up all your possessions. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. What he's saying is be generous with the resources that you have. Sell some things and give to the poor. We can do that because God is faithful to us. There are 2 kinds of treasures, aren't there, that Jesus speaks about here in this passage. There's the treasure that grows old and that rots, or that thieves can break in and steal, that lets you down in the end, or there's the treasure that lasts. What's the treasure that lasts? Well, Jesus says it's to be found by seeking God and his kingdom first. You see, a relationship with this great and wonderful God as our Father through Jesus Christ, that's the greatest treasure. And from that flows so many of these other great and good things. But we can trust God for it. Jesus is saying to busy Christians, listen, this should be your basic approach to life, always. So we need to ask ourselves, are we anxious? Yeah, we do get anxious, but are we anxious and lacking trust in God? We constantly try to gain control over things that are actually beyond our control. Jesus says, don't worry. What does worry add to your life? It doesn't add a thing. You can't, by worrying, add anything to your life. So do we trust God to provide for all our needs? And that trust then frees us to follow him with joy and to honor other people in our relationships, pursuing righteousness and serving others with our resources and with our lives. And you see, this trusting attitude, which is fundamental to the life of discipleship that Jesus is calling us to, it's based on this wonderful promise. You can almost miss it. It's in verse 32. Jesus gives it here. Listen to this. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. That's an incredible promise, isn't it? Don't be afraid, little flock. Your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. That's truly amazing. This great God has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Little flock, Jesus says. He addresses his disciples like that, doesn't he? I think he deliberately uses that picture, of course. It's the picture of perhaps a rather timid or tender, easily frightened sheep. We need the care of a shepherd. And I think Jesus deliberately compares us, disciples, believers, to these rather fragile creatures. Little flock, little lambs, sheep. We're not lions and bears. No. And the Father is the shepherd, of course, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, and he promises to give everything associated with the kingdom to his sheep. We may be fragile, we may be small, we may be timid, we may be, in our eyes, insignificant, but God has promised to care for us and to make us strong. And it's this promise, I think, this promise is like a hinge on which the door of discipleship turns, isn't it? Don't be afraid, little flock. Your Father's been pleased to give you the kingdom, this eternal kingdom. And it's a hinge phrase and truth, isn't it? Because the rest of this paragraph in this chapter, which we didn't read, really, that's where it fits in. The remaining verses tell us and warn us. Jesus' promise here fits into that whole scenario of persecution and of rejection and of difficulty and risks. So whatever risk comes from trusting Jesus, whatever isolation perhaps, whatever persecution, whatever ostracism, whatever difficulties, know that God will care for you. That's what Jesus is saying to his disciples. It's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Kingdom blessings will be provided. It's not a promise of abundant material blessing, but of sufficient, all-sufficient grace and provision to do what God wants you to do with your life. So, be trusting. That's the first one. Be ready then, says Jesus. Verses 35 to 48. We didn't read it, but we know the words. That's the summary of this next paragraph. And an important piece of advice for busy Christians. Be ready. Maybe especially for busy Christians, because our lives are so full and we can become so preoccupied with the here and now. And there's nothing particularly wrong in that, but Jesus is saying, be ready. Remember where your life is heading. What's he saying to be remember for? Well, be ready for the appearing of the Son of Man, for the appearing of Jesus the second time. That's what he's speaking about here. And so to illustrate the point, Jesus uses two different pictures, images. He says we should be like servants who wait for their master to return from the wedding celebrations. Disciples should be ready for their Lord to appear any time at the door, to knock on the door. Oh, he's back. In those days, as in some parts of the world today, wedding feasts can last for up to a week. And so the master could be gone for a week. And so the exact time of someone's return was not always predictable. So the servants had to be ready at any time. Whenever the master decided he'd had enough of the wedding ceremony and wanted to come back home and knock the door, they had to be ready. The place had to be ready. The house had to be swept and cleaned and the food ready and so on. Disciples of Jesus should live in the same expectation. Doesn't mean you stop doing stuff, but you're ready when Jesus comes again. Or another picture, he says, it will be good for the faithful and wise manager, says Jesus, whose master finds him doing what he has commanded him when he returns. Slightly different picture. Busy Christians, says Jesus, are to be busy serving the master so that we're ready for him in his return. Believers, Christians, we know that Jesus is returning. We say we believe it. It's in the Bible, it's in the New Testament, the second coming of Jesus. Do we really think about that? How much does it shape our decisions and our thinking and our long-term planning? The Bible teaches us that Jesus is returning and that we will give an account for our stewardship. Not that we'll be saved by it, but that we'll be asked to give an account for our stewardship, or our management of the responsibilities and the opportunities that we've been presented with in our lives as disciples. So be ready. This is a call to be future-focused as disciples of Jesus. That's our focus, it's the future. Because you see, the reality of the future helps to determine our present priorities. We are future-focused people. Jesus wants to make sure his disciples are prepared for what is coming. Faith means trusting God, not only for the present, but also for the future. And for disciples, you see, of Jesus, what God will do in the future affects what we do now, or at least it should. So again, important advice for busy Christians. How much does what God is going to do in the future, how much is Jesus coming again and establishing his kingdom in all its fullness, how much is that affecting how you live now? Your priorities now, your decisions now, the way you spend your money now, your possessions now. Where is your treasure? Be trusting, be ready. Thirdly, Jesus says, be courageous, therefore. Verses 49 to 53, be courageous. Now, if you've got a Bible and you're reading there, well, at first reading, this is a very troubling paragraph, really. It's even a confusing paragraph. Let me just read some of the words. We hear words like this. Jesus says, I have come to bring fire on the earth, and oh, how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Do you think I came to bring peace on the earth? No, I tell you, but division. Wow. So, what discipleship lessons are we to learn here? You can see how I said at the beginning that they seem to be almost disjointed paragraphs here, but there's a theme running through. Didn't Jesus come to earth to bring peace, we say? And yet here he seems to be defining his mission in terms of bringing fire and division. And there's a baptism, he says, that I've got to undergo, and I wish it was already completed. So what's going on here? Isn't Jesus the Prince of Peace? Well, the answer is, of course, yes. Of course he is. Jesus came to earth to reconcile mankind to God, but that peace came at a price. That peace came at a price. It came at a price for him as the instrument of that reconciliation, the one through whom it should come, and it comes at a price for those who would follow him too, for disciples. Jesus is referring here, I think, not to the baptism that he brings, that disciples are to undergo to identify with Jesus, not public baptism in that sense, but he's referring to a special baptism, to the one that he himself must undergo. He himself receives, and in the context, the baptism which Jesus is speaking about is a reference to the cross. That's what's on his mind. He's on his way to Jerusalem. He's in this travel narrative, isn't he? And he's teaching his disciples before he gets there. And what's in Jerusalem? The cross. And that event dominates every moment of his life and every moment and shape of his mission. Because you see, in Jesus, he's the one who embodies the very presence of God amongst us. He's Emmanuel, God with us. But in Jesus, the fire of God's judgment is carried by the Messiah himself, by Jesus himself. That's the heart of the mission. That's why he speaks as he does. And the truth of his identity and of his mission has always been a cause for division. That's what Jesus is meaning here. It's inevitable. From the very beginning, from the scribes and the Pharisees in Jesus' day, who we've already seen in Luke's Gospel, who are opposing him, divided against him, to the scoffers and the mockers in the world of Rome as the church spread and the gospel was preached, right down to the present day. The identity and mission of Jesus causes division. We have to decide. And in some places of the world today, sometimes that division is more clearly and acutely seen and felt, of course, as we've already heard again this morning. Some parts of the world where Christians are very aware of the division and the sword, the opposition that comes to them because of following Jesus. But equally, this is what Jesus is saying here, he says even within the same family, it doesn't have to be outward and awful fighting, but even within the same family there's going to be division. There's going to be a difference of opinion over Jesus. So that's why he calls his disciples to be courageous, to stand for him. Because you see, the kingdom that Jesus came to establish and he comes to proclaim represents a totally different order from the order that we know and that we experience as people of this world. This kingdom is governed not by might, but by forgiveness. Not by fear, but by courage. Don't be afraid, he says. Not by power, but by humility. So it's completely at odds with the status quo. Those who've invested in the present order. The rich fool, if you like. Those who are just living for now. Those who are lured by wealth and status and power. Those who rule now, if you like. Those who are in power. They will resist this kingdom coming, of course. It spells an end to the sort of kingdom that they know, that they love, that they live for. Hence Jesus, though coming to establish a rule of peace, of course he is, he brings division, even to the most intimate relationships, as he says here, even amongst families. From now on, there will be 5 in one family divided, each against the other. So, disciple of Jesus, be courageous. In one sense, we can say, you can expect it if you're following Jesus. And finally, Jesus says, be wise. Be wise. Verses 54 to the end. As Jesus speaks of his ministry, here we didn't read it, but he tells his listeners to be, well, it's almost like forecasting the weather. That's what he says here. He said to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say, it's going to rain, and it does. And when the south wind blows, you say, it's going to be hot, and it is. Hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? He says, you can look, even with your eyes, and to a certain extent predict the weather. You're wise in that sense. A westerly wind can blow in from the Mediterranean and, okay, there's going to be rain, and so on. The signs of the times were indicated by these visible things, and they could read them. And they were experts, especially the farmers, amongst the people that Jesus addressed. In that sense, they were wise. They can read the signs of the times regarding the weather, but, says Jesus, you can't tell the breezes that are blowing through your lives right now because of my coming. You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? You're missing the signs. The signs of the times are everywhere, actually. but you're spiritually blind. You see, not reading these spiritual weather signs correctly is very dangerous. It's true, isn't it? In the material world, it's more dangerous than missing a hurricane or a tsunami, says Jesus. We've just been having bad weather in the UK, so we've been listening to the weather forecast. They've just had Storm Doris. Wow. And nothing like what some continents experience. But there were gales of 90 miles an hour, and there was destruction of property and so on. So we've been listening. And for about 3 or 4 days, beginning of the week, BBC was warning, Storm Doris is on its way, batten down the hatches, and so on. And people take notice of the warnings, the weather forecasts. Well, says Jesus, be wise. Take warning of these spiritual weather signs. If you don't, then you're being foolish. Or another picture he uses here. It's that of someone being hauled off to the magistrates because he's failed to pay his debts. Be wise, says Jesus. Sure, it's better to settle your debts before you get to court and risk imprisonment. As you are going with your adversary to the magistrate, try hard to be reconciled on the way, or your adversary may drag you off to the judge, and the judge turn you over to the officer, and the officer throw you into prison. Well, don't go down that route, says Jesus. Settle it before you get there. And the disciple of Jesus must live in such a way that his debt to God is settled every day as he repents and trusts in the one whom God has sent to pay the debt, to redeem us. We all have debts before God that need paying every day. And we need to settle those accounts with God. We don't want to let things build up. Keep short accounts with God. And that means coming daily through Jesus Christ, asking him for forgiveness. So he says, be wise. We need to be trusting, we need to be ready, we need to be courageous, we need to be wise. We need to settle our debts, says Jesus, before you meet the judge. And live in such a way that when you meet the judge, you will not be ashamed. If you don't, then bankruptcy and debtor's prison will be the result of your ignoring the signs, of your rejecting God. And you'll be no better off than the rich fool. We saw last week he was bankrupt towards God. He was not rich towards God. And as disciples, of course, we know only Jesus can pay our debt. That's why he came. Only Jesus can pay our debt. And we need to come to him daily, follow him daily along life's way. And because only Jesus can pay our debt, that's why he is our treasure. There's no one like him. There's no one else worth following. And because of Jesus and our treasure in him, it's for his kingdom that we live every day. You are my strength when I am weak. You are the treasure that I seek. You are my all in all. Seeking you as a precious jewel, Lord, to give up, I'd be a fool. You are my all in all. Can we really say that as disciples of Jesus? Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So live your life this week, trusting, ready, courageous, wise, for God's glory.